Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to the Brian Dainsberg podcast, Christian Living in a Complicated World. I'm your host, Brian Dainsberg, lead pastor of Alliance Bible Church. Today, we are going to be tackling the subject of religious liberty. Conversations surrounding religious liberty have not been well tied, historically have not been well tied to theology. Instead, it is often perceived as an sort of accident of history, a social construct, some sort of settlement born out of pragmatic need. And I understand that it's a kind of a culture war issue. But what religious liberty needs is an apologetic arising from Christian conviction. We need actually more theological and biblical reflection on religious liberty so we can anchor this subject more to biblical motifs than vague isms or even the U.S. Constitution. So my intent in this podcast is not to offer a civics class, but a theology class to help us think less constitutionally about religious liberty and more biblically about religious liberty. I'm going to be quoting extensively from three authors who have done a superb job of thinking biblically and theologically about these topics. I'll put the names of the books, authors, down in the notes section of the episode. But the first book is Liberty for All by Andrew Walker. Another is Politics After Christendom by David Van Drunen, and Political Church by Jonathan Leeman. All are superb works. It's impossible for me to cover, that's why I recommend the books. It's impossible for me to cover this topic thoroughly. But what I'm going to do is basically talk through three theological moorings and then finish with three applications. It's a little academic, this podcast, a little academic, but that's just the nature of it. I'm going to look at three theological moorings. Here are the three moorings, then I'll talk through them. The theological moorings are the Noahic covenant in religious liberty, the Imago Dei in religious liberty, and Christian mission in religious liberty. And then I'll finish off with applications. First is the Noahic covenant and religious liberty. Noahic, that is Noah. Let me read from Genesis 6. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. This, of course, sets the stage for the flood. God instructs Noah to build an ark and bring his family along with other wildlife aboard, and then says, 7 days from now I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made. And God makes good on his word. The rain falls and every living creature is wiped from the face of the earth. God is starting over, sort of. When Noah and his family get off the boat, we read this. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky, on every creature that moves along the ground and all the fish in the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. And then it continues, but you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal and from each human being too. I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. As for you, be fruitful and increase in number. Multiply on the earth and increase upon it. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, all the wild animals, and those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And so God makes a covenant with Noah, but not just with Noah, with the entire human race down to this day. From this point forward in the Bible story, nowhere does God replace or eliminate this covenant he's made. And this covenant is with the entire world population. While God's covenant with the church may be applicable just to Christian believers, the Noahic covenant is applicable to the entire human race, people of all religious backgrounds. And the core attribute of this covenant isn't salvation from evil, but to sustain and maintain the world, to sustain and maintain human society despite the abiding presence of evil. This covenant is about preserving the human race. Now, this covenant doesn't constitute a grand agenda, but it does address the basic requirements for human society to survive. There are 3 basic requirements needed for human society to survive: reproduction, eating, and administering justice. Dave Van Drunen in his book writes this: the Noahic covenant calls the human race to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, authorizes it to eat plants and animals, though not animals with their lifeblood, and grants it responsibility to enact retributive justice against murderers. This is what lies on the face of the text. It is a modest ethic, although that seems appropriate given the limited preservative purpose of the covenant. This ethic deals with things that are absolutely necessary for the human race to survive. But if we probe a little deeper, we discover that this 3-fold Noahic ethic implies a number of activities beyond what the text says explicitly. I propose that the Noahic covenant commissions human beings to form a variety of institutions, and that common political communities properly arise as they carry out this commission. What he's saying is that there is implied within the Noahic covenant the expectation that certain institutions and associations will be created as the human population grows in order for the human race to faithfully live out this God-given 3-fold requirement of reproduction, eating, and administering justice. So let's think through that. What sort of institution arises as a result of reproduction? Well, we don't have to overthink that. Familial institutions, families. Van Drunen writes, to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth demands an interconnected set of activities, particularly the procreation, nurture, and training of children. What is needed is not just a proper context for sexual intercourse, but also a setting in which adults can care for the children procreated and teach them how to live productively in the world. These institutions that serve as forums for sexual intercourse, procreation, and the nurture and training of children are precisely what we call families. In other words, when God created this covenant with Noah, he had in mind the family. God's expectation of the human race being pro-family is still binding to this day because the Noahic covenant is still in effect. That's the first aspect to the Noahic ethic. There's this 3-fold Noahic ethic. That's the first. It's families, reproduction, families. What about the second aspect of the Noahic covenant? Eating. What sort of institutions or associations are needed to ensure the world's population is fed? I'm not sure what you would call them, but they are engaged in exploring, farming, building, technological innovation. I mean, think about the necessary systems that ensure the survival of families. The creation and sustenance of these associations is necessary for human beings to maintain fidelity to the Noahic covenant. And finally, what institutions or associations are necessary to fulfill the third aspect of the Noahic ethic, and that is to bring justice against destructive people who harm fellow human beings and thus hinder the work of families and those serving to feed them and contribute to their overall survival? Well, it seems fitting to call these judicial institutions. God's covenant with Noah is the starting point, in my view, for the legitimacy of government. Chapter 1 in the book that hasn't been written, How to Govern Well, starts with God's covenant with Noah. Van Drunen again writes, familial and enterprise associations can develop their own ways of resolving internal disputes, but many human conflicts require outside parties to bring resolution. Thus, judicial institutions become necessary to determine what sorts of harmful conduct require redress, to solve conflicts, and to enforce appropriate penalties and remedies. These judicial institutions need not be arms of the state, since private organizations can provide security, mediation, arbitration, and related services. But the need for such institutions presents a context in which civil government arguably becomes a morally plausible idea. Now listen again to the verses that talk about administering justice. And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal and from each human being too. I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. This is God's expectation of all humanity. This is the core of administering justice. This is what is called lex talionis. A person who harms another person deserves a proportionate penalty. Notice something in the Noahic covenant. We see that God has not authorized judicial institutions, governments, to prosecute crimes against himself. The penal code of Genesis 9, the Noahic covenant, adjudicates wrongs between fellow human beings, not wrongs between human beings and God. Now listen carefully. This doesn't mean that God grants a right to rebel against him. It does not mean that. But it does mean God prohibits judicial institutions from vindicating God through retributive or punitive actions. This is where Andrew Walker's helpful. He writes, the Noahic covenant reveals that adequate social cooperation can occur apart from absolute agreement on religious matters for society to remain legitimate and ordered toward the common good. He continues, the Noahic covenant implies that while society cannot exist without a common morality, it can exist without a common religion. And finishes by saying what this means practically is that only forms of worship that physically harm other persons should be restrained or punished in light of the minimalist social order of Genesis 9. So it is my view that the Noahic covenant, which is still binding, essentially says to government, when it comes to religion, hands off. Don't promote it, don't forbid it. Theological belief or religious belief is not the world government is to operate in. However, the government has a responsibility to create a modicum of social stability that allows even conflicting beliefs within a population to be held without fear of retributive action on the part of the state. So where would it be wise for government to intervene in religious matters according to the Noahic covenant? Well, if Baalism made a comeback and we saw the horrific practice of children being sacrificed to the god Moloch, it would be right for government to intervene. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. The Noahic covenant gives the state the responsibility to establish a common morality, not a common religion. It gives the state the responsibility to provide a modicum of social stability that allows even conflicting religious beliefs to be held without fear of retributive action on the part of the state. And so in the Noahic covenant, God created the conditions or the possibility for pluralism. Andrew Walker writes, in the Garden of Eden, pluralism did not exist, and there will not be religious pluralism in the new creation. But nowhere in the interim era of the New Testament age is government tasked with the responsibility of upholding Christian orthodoxy or any religious orthodoxy as a way to mitigate the effects of sin, moral disagreement, and religious pluralism. The God of the Bible gives governments authority to prosecute crimes against human beings, not the authority to prosecute crimes against himself. So long as people remain unharmed, false religion should be tolerated publicly and privately. This is Jonathan Leeman. So in grounding religious liberty for all religions, along theological lines, God, through the Noahic covenant, says to government, when it comes to religion, hands off. Don't promote it, don't forbid it. Instead, create a social stability, a social order that allows even conflicting beliefs within a population to be held without fear of retributive action on the part of the state. As long as human beings aren't harming one another, harming property, harming possessions, material security, as long as all of that is stable, the government is not going to be involved in arbitrating over doctrinal or theological matters. And all of that is generated from the Noahic covenant. So let me move the second mooring, the second theological mooring, the imago Dei and religious liberty. Because human beings are made in God's image, we are at an irreducible level religious beings. What does it mean to be God's image? Theologians have posited numerous implications of that descriptive term. A couple of the best would say that we possess a vice-regent ruling aspect to us, that is, to rule on God's behalf with capacities similar to that of God, while at the same time faithfully representing Him. We are His image, not someone else's image. Therefore, there's a representational aspect to all human beings, and therefore God's image bearers are by default religious creatures, where it is incumbent on us to rule the creation, that is, to live in the created order in such a way that bears likeness to our Creator. So human beings, because we are the image of God, are at an irreducible level religious beings. Matthew 22. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, you hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax. And they brought him a denarius, and he asked them, whose image is this, and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then he said to them, so give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. When they heard this, they were amazed. They left him and went away. Now, just as a quick aside, some people's consciences are torn up that their tax dollars are being spent on unjust causes. I would say Jesus doesn't want your conscience torn up over that. And these verses prove it. Jesus gives legitimacy to the state's tax collecting power and issues an imperative to his followers to pay their taxes. Thus, his followers in paying taxes helped to fund Jesus' execution, the gravest injustice in human history. No text holds Jesus' followers accountable for their financial contribution to his death through the payment of taxes. God will not hold taxpayers accountable for what was done with their tax contributions. However, the state's unjust use of tax revenue isn't something that in the end God will overlook, because even Caesar bears the image of God. Governing authorities bear the image of God. Whoever bears God's image owes to God what is legitimately due him. There isn't a human being that has ever lived that can escape that divine expectation. And so what is the bearing of religious liberty? Well, the state cannot stand in the way of its population rendering to God what is legitimately due God because they bear his image. And in bearing his image, we come preloaded, wired to live in ways that image God, which is profoundly religious. So when someone hears the question, do the scriptures teach religious liberty? A Bible-believing Christian would likely have the instincts to say, duh, And I wouldn't fault them for that because of this particular point, the imago Dei. God made us profoundly and inescapably religious creatures and expects us to practice that Bible religion without the state creating problems for us doing so. The third theological mooring is Christian mission and religious liberty. Christian mission and religious liberty. Now, before leaving on his missionary journey to India, William Carey, one of the architects of the modern mission movement, told his friend Andrew Fuller, "I will go down if you will hold the ropes." Fuller helped raise the funds to build the institutions that made mission possible. Fuller held the ropes while Carey went down. Holding the ropes is an apt metaphor for the relationship between religious liberty and mission. Religious liberty facilitates mission by giving space and fostering the ideal conditions for the mission of Church of Christ to continue. The mission of God does not wholly depend on Western ideals of religious liberty, but it is aided where religious liberty exists. Ask this in reverse. What Christian would want to create obstacles for the announcement of the gospel? Answer, no one, of course. To hold the rope, so to speak, is to facilitate mission. This runs contrary to much of modern Christian discourse that seems to lust after martyrdom status, insisting that any demands for rights, such as religious liberty, run contrary to the witness of Christ, who forsook his rights and died on a cross. Well, okay. Let's think about that. Consider Paul. Paul, as a Roman citizen, Paul did not shy away from asserting his rights as a Roman citizen. You can read about this in Acts 22. Instead of seeking out a martyr's death so that the purity of the gospel could be realized, Paul appealed to his political context and the legitimacy of political rule to ensure the gospel spread. He did so by appealing to his Roman citizenship and to the political rulers of his day. For Paul, appeals to earthly citizenship were not in opposition to his heavenly citizenship. The former is subordinate to the latter. Paul's life testifies to the legitimacy of political rule and also to the need to constructively relate to political authority in such a way that it is not in opposition to the advance of the gospel. Walker writes again, he says, those who criticize defenders of religious liberty for making a culture war issue and possessing martyr envy will likely someday learn that were ancient Christians to choose between Rome and America, they would have chosen the First Amendment. Now, the scriptures promise persecution. Yeah, no doubt about that. And there's only so much that can be done to prevent it. So we should be ready to be faithful when it comes, but be wary of those who romanticize marginalization and valorize martyrdom. 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 through 4. Paul writes, I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. This is good and pleases God our Savior, who wants all people to be saved and to come to knowledge of the truth. This is religious liberty and Christian mission wrapped up in a bow for us. Paul exhorts the church in Ephesus to pray for all people, including governing authorities. But it's not praying for them for no reason. Paul follows this exhortation up with a purpose clause, so that we may live peaceful and quiet lives. Bob Yarbrough in his commentary writes, Paul likely wants prayers at Ephesus to aim for social, political, and economic stability conducive to everyone's well-being, that of Christians included. This peaceful and quiet life Paul longs for isn't the privatization of the Christian faith, but rather having the social conditions wherein Christians can live their lives the way God has called them to, without the state making it burdensome to do so. He desires a social order that makes it conducive for believers to go about the tasks God sets in place for them, including proclaiming the gospel, as verse 4 makes clear. This is good and pleases God our Savior, who wants all people to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. Paul directly connects his desire for the lost to come to faith with praying for a social order that allows Christians to go about their calling unencumbered. Paul is gently saying, let's pray the government stays out of the church's way. While martyrdom is inevitable in some situations, the scriptures don't teach praying for it. It teaches the opposite. Pray for conditions that allow us to execute the mission Jesus has called us to without the state making it burdensome to do so. So those are three theological moorings of biblical moorings, theological moorings for religious liberty. I want to finish with applications. First, Christians should be advocates for the religious liberty of all people. According to the Noahic covenant, it is not the place of government to sponsor one religion, as it is the case in Saudi Arabia, nor is it the place of government to forbid religion, as was the case with communist governments of the 20th century. According to the Noahic covenant, when it comes to religion, it is to be hands-off. Don't promote it, don't forbid it. Instead, it is the state's responsibility to create a modicum of social stability that allows even conflicting beliefs within a population to be held without fear of retributive action on the part of the state. So first of all, Christians should be advocates of the religious liberty of all people. Second, Christians should work for Christian conceptions of justice in the public square. One thing I didn't unpack was this. What standard of justice did God expect judicial institutions to operate by? Well, God expects the state to uphold a common good, a common morality, not a common religion. It's there to punish bad behavior, not bad doctrine. They are responsible to maintain social stability. But how would people who don't subscribe to the Christian scriptures, who don't follow Jesus, determine what that morality should be? Well, the short answer is God expects them to hold to a biblical morality in their governing. Let me read an extensive passage from Dave Van Drunen's book. He writes this: the Old Testament contains many accounts of judgment God brought or promised to bring upon wicked Gentile nations and their rulers. In one of the most famous, God rained fire and brimstone from heaven upon Sodom and Gomorrah in response to the great outcry against these cities and their very grave sin. The Old Testament prophets also provide numerous examples through their oracles against non-Israelite communities. Such oracles appear in all of the major prophets and some of the minor prophets. The oracles serve different purposes in different contexts, but many of them announce coming divine judgment against these nations' sins, and some of them address rulers specifically. They often target nations that have oppressed or mocked God's covenant people, Israel. Surely a source of encouragement for the church and of warning for hostile governments today. God held all of these nations accountable and permitted them no space for neutrality. It is remarkable that in the texts cited above, God never judges these nations or their rulers for idolatry as he did with Israel. This indicates that he did not condemn them for failure to establish true religious worship and exclude the non-compliant. God condemned them instead for egregious acts of injustice or crimes against humanity. In Amos 1 and 2, for example, he brings charges for acts such as slave trading, violent treaties, and ripping open pregnant women. This makes sense. God holds governments and their officials accountable for promoting justice, but does not wish them to exclude people on the basis of religious identity. God ordains commonality and accountability simultaneously. Many nations and their rulers have not had and do not have knowledge of the Christian scriptures, and God holds them accountable for administering justice nonetheless. The prophet Daniel told King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, the most powerful ruler in the world in about 600 BC, "O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity." Daniel is calling a secular governing leader to live in accordance with a biblical ethic in his governing. In the New Testament, John the Baptist rebuked Herod the Tetrarch. He was a civil governor under the Roman Empire. Rebuked Herod the Tetrarch for Herodias, his brother's wife, and for all the evil things that Herod had done. Certainly, John's rebuke of all the evil things included many acts that Herod had done as a governmental ruler. John the Baptist, a Christian, is calling him out for his failure to live in accordance with biblical morality. Later, the Apostle Paul reasoned with the Roman governor Felix, quote, about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, end quote. It's likely that Paul was calling Felix to account for his conduct as a government official under the Roman Empire, and Felix was alarmed, the text says, and sent Paul away. See, God holds secular nations and secular leaders accountable to a common morality that squares with Scripture. All people have this knowledge. Theologians sometimes call it natural law. One such appeal to it occurs in Romans 1. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known of God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. All human beings have a God-given intuition as to what is right and good and just. This is why Daniel and John the Baptist and Paul felt compelled to appeal to secular leaders to govern according to it. This is why God has and will judge nations and national leaders according to it. Therefore, Christians should work for Christian conceptions of justice in the public square. And just as MLK advocated, a Christian conception of justice is one that squares with the moral law of God. So, first, we should be advocates for religious liberty for all people. Second, we should work for Christian conception of justice in the public square. Third, Christians should pray for national leaders to govern according to a biblically moral framework. When Paul is saying it is good for Christians to live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness, he doesn't mean the Christian life is to be lived in the privacy of one's own home only or inside one's head only. Paul was a very public Christian. He sought out public places where he could engage in debate to reason with people so they would become followers of Christ. He was visibly persuasive. Certainly, the Christian life, all that God has commissioned us to do, is lived in the sight of all. The Christian faith is a very public faith. So, Paul is saying, pray that our governing leaders will not make it difficult for us to live out our calling publicly and visibly. And so, Christian, I would say to you, pray. Pray our governing leaders will aim for social, political, and economic stability that is conducive to everyone's well-being, including the well-being of Christians and the mission of the church. Let me finish this one thought here. Daniel chapter 2, and in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. As we advocate for religious liberty, based on all these theological moorings and the applications that arise out of them, Christians cannot lose sight of something. We cannot lose sight of the fact that earthly kingdoms rise and fall, and that includes the United States. History demonstrates that. But one kingdom will never fall, and that is the kingdom of Christ. So let's not tether our ultimate hope to religious liberty in the United States. Tether your hope to our coming King, where all will be made right and will be so forever. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.